This is a response to the video The Thermian Argument on the Folding Ideas YouTube channel. I don't entirely disagree with the premise of this video, but hopefully you'll understand what I'm getting at by the end of my video.
Before we start, here's a pop quiz. How do you kill a vampire? Sunlight, stake to the heart, holy water, fire, decapitation, silver bullet? Write your answer down and we'll come back to it later.
It depends on which story the vampire comes from. I'll just say sunlight since that is one of the most common methods.
So previously we talked about the diegesis and the attendant mental construct, the fiction space alternate universe that stories exist in inside our heads.
This was like a 3-part series he did where he started with diegetic, followed by the Thermian Argument and the hypothetical case study of Assassin 47. If you want the full explanation, you can go watch the entire video.
Today, we're going to talk about boundaries. Specifically, we're going to be talking about diegetic justification for creepy garbage and how terrible and flawed it is as an argument.
Let's see where you're going with this.
So there's a bad habit that people have gotten into. It's nothing new, but it's becoming more and more common, and it goes like this. Hello, this is Folding Ideas. I recently watched the anime Women Getting Ripped Apart by Orcs and was disturbed by the seeming perverse glee the show takes in the way it frames the frequent and excessive dismemberment of its female cast members. In fact, the entire purpose of the show seems to be little more than showing women being brutally violated by orcs. Minor characters with little plot significance are often subjected to 2 or 3 minute sequences that focus an almost pornographic lens on their suffering and the enjoyment the orcs take in the process.
So what you are doing is giving a critique to a piece of media.
Dan Olson is wrong to complain. If he thinks this is a big deal, then he clearly wasn't paying attention. The orcs were created by the Dread God who hates all light. The Dread God wanted an army that would rape and shred its way across the land of Thule. So the orcs aren't just violent for no reason. They are compelled to be violent. It all makes sense if you were paying attention to the backstory.
And then you are explaining how people dismiss the point you are trying to make. I don't entirely disagree with you, but this itself could lead into a larger discussion. However, let's just take your argument at face value and assume there is a problem. I'm going to take your argument and reword it so I can make my point. So there's a bad habit people have gotten into. It's nothing new, but it's become more and more common, and it goes like this. Hello, this is Mr. Male Trope. I recently watched the video series Tropes vs. Women in Video Games and had, questions about the seeming deliberate misrepresentations of the way women are represented in mature titles and the false implications of the game developer's intent. In fact, the entire purpose of this video series seems to be about using manipulative language to make these games seem more harmful than they really are. In some cases, there are factual inaccuracies or outright lies with what is said about particular video games. Mr. Male Trope is wrong to complain. If you think there are issues with Anita Sarkeesian's videos, then you clearly weren't paying attention. The video series was created by a pop culture critic who has an in-depth knowledge of feminism that you don't possess. If you can't understand what she is saying, then it is you who is misrepresenting her. The point I'm getting at is there are problems with some of the arguments made by feminists and social justice warriors. When challenged on it, your side gives the same style responses that you are currently talking about.
This has become a pretty familiar exchange over the last few years, and the base components are this. 1, some element of a movie, anime, or video game is criticized, usually for racism or sexism. 2, fans defend it by citing in-universe reasons for why the world of the text is the way that it is.
This has become a pretty familiar exchange over the last few years, and the base components are this. 1, some elements of Tropes vs. Women in video games are criticized, usually for misrepresentations or factual inaccuracies. 2, fans defend it by saying sexism in video games is a real issue and justifies the existence of Tropes vs. Women in video games.
Here's the problem. Fictional worlds aren't real and are eternally mutable by creators. They are the sum of a giant pile of creative decisions made by 1, 2, a dozen, 100 different individuals who took it from blank page to finished product.
Here's the problem. Feminist Frequency's videos are used as educational tools and should be scrutinized for factual accuracy if she wants them taught in classrooms. The misrepresentations, manipulation, and lies are a creative decision made by one or two people who took it from a concept to a finished product.
The only reason anything is the way that it is because a writer chose to make it that way.
Feminist Frequency chose to make tropes versus women in video games that way.
The diegetic argument aims to dismiss criticism at its core, suggesting that there aren't any problems with the text provided controversial elements are internally consistent with the rest of the story world.
It's similar to tropes versus women in video games. Because there may be legitimate issues with sexism in video games, there are a plethora of reasons given why critics of Anita Sarkeesian shouldn't be listened to.
In slang terms, this can be referred to as the Thermian argument. In the sci-fi classic Galaxy Quest, the Thermians don't understand fiction as a concept. It doesn't exist in their language, and thus they see all texts as historical documents.
Several representations of women that Anita Sarkeesian disagrees with are labeled as sexism. Several representations of men that Jonathan McIntosh disagrees with are labeled as toxic masculinity. They can't conceive that some representations are not as problematic as they see it, so in their minds it's all sexist or toxic masculinity.
While not identical, the root figure of thought is similar here. The diegesis is given primacy over the text as a cultural product. The exact rationale behind a Thermian argument may even end up being contradictory from one case to another. One medieval game with dragons and magic, but no one with brown skin, is fine as is because historical accuracy. In a different medieval game, a character wears a chainmail bikini to a war zone because it's just a fantasy and that's just how her tribe dresses. You cannot criticize the world because that's just the way the world is.
Feminist Frequency also has contradictions in their arguments. In the case of the Damsel in Distress Part 1, the associated tropes are not part of the trope itself.
Let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the designated victim, the heroic rescue, and the smooch of victory. However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the damsel in distress trope itself. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero for the benefit of his story arc.
Anita made it crystal clear what the trope is and what is not part of the trope itself. Then in Part 2, she combined it with other separate tropes.
So we've seen developers try to spice up the damsel in distress cliché by combining it with other tropes that involve victimized women. I've identified a few of the most common of these trope cocktails, which join together multiple regressive or negative representations of women, including the disposable woman, the mercy killing, and the woman in the refrigerator.
When Anita talks about Princess Peach as a damsel in distress, we aren't allowed to talk about games outside the core series.
Peach does of course appear in many spin-offs such as the Mario Party, Mario Sports, and Mario Kart series, as well as the Super Smash Bros. Nintendo Universe crossover fighting games. However, all of these spin-offs fall well outside of the core Super Mario series of platformers.
However, when Anita wants to step outside the core series, then it's perfectly fine as long as Princess Peach happens to be the star of the game.
She is the star of only one adventure, and we'll get to that a little later.
And the whole point of talking about Super Princess Peach was to talk about how Peach was poorly represented in that game.
Back in our first episode, I mentioned that Princess Peach is the star of exactly one platformer. That game is called Super Princess Peach, so finally, after being kidnapped in 13 separate Super Mario games, Peach gets to be the hero for once. But don't get too excited, because everything else about the game ends up in a train wreck of gendered stereotypes.
If Anita can step outside the core series of Mario games to talk about the representation of Princess Peach, why can't I do the same in games such as Super Smash Bros. Or Mario Kart, where she is represented better? How is Anita's logic any different than what you are currently talking about?
You cannot criticize the world because that's just the way the world is.
Am I not allowed to criticize Anita's videos because that's just the way her videos are?
This is a deeply flawed argument because, once again, fictional worlds aren't real and are eternally mutable by creators. None of it actually exists. The only part that does exist is the finished text and the idea that it represents.
Similar things could be said about tropes versus women in video games.
So let's go back to the quiz. How do you kill a vampire? It doesn't matter what you wrote, the answer is irrelevant. Vampires aren't real.
So my answer of sunlight doesn't matter, because vampires aren't real.
While the rules for how to kill a vampire may be codified within any given game, movie, book, or show, nothing exists to enforce the rules of a fictional space. Writers routinely alter the rules to suit their interests and the needs of their story. So, in the world outside the diegesis, in our world, only the implications and impact of that fiction actually matter.
So let's talk about the world outside of tropes versus women in video games. Since Anita Sarkeesian entered the gaming scene, I've seen a lot of hate directed at game developers over female representations. I've seen games deliberately misrepresented and game developers shamed for doing nothing wrong. Anita Sarkeesian may have sparked an interesting discussion, but some of the problems I've seen in the video game industry and gaming culture are largely due to her presence, as well as that of her producer and co-writer, Jonathan McIntosh.
That's why this type of dismissal, using a diegetic justification to nullify criticism, is ultimately a chump argument.
Some of the methods used to dismiss people who criticize feminists and social justice warriors are also chump arguments.
Unlike world history, where there is a theoretical objective truth that we can seek to better and more accurately represent, fictional worlds are fiction. There is no truth to move towards. Arguments for purity or consistency miss the point entirely. The Thermian argument, therefore, serves only to shut down discussion.
However, with educational tools such as videos produced by Feminist Frequency, there is a basis for factual accuracy that can be moved toward.
Criticism of a creative work is ultimately criticism of the decisions that people made when they were putting it together.
Ultimately, if the author of the same piece of media listens to your arguments and still decides they want to make the anime women getting ripped apart by orcs, then they have a right to do that, whether it disturbs you or not.